We're back with the CHARA Project. I'm Heather.
I'm Sarah.
And we've been uncovering different passages across the New Testament, and we've been using our CHARA Bible Study guide for not only to learn how to study the Bible, but to know what questions to ask when we do study the Bible so that we read the Bible on its own terms. You can download this guide off of our website, but you also can access study guides that go specifically along with each one of our episodes, and specifically today's you can find on our website to be able to do Bible study around this passage by yourself or in a group. Easy access for you to come alongside of us as we spend time in the Bible together today. Today's verse is 1 Corinthians 14:34. This is a verse that can often be used when talking about women's roles within ministry, and it's one that both Sarah, you and I have studied quite a bit, along with many others, because it obviously impacts us as women in ministry. This is what our verse says. This is 1 Corinthians 14:34. It says, "Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says." This is a very important verse, not only for us as women, but also just because it's a very important verse to be able to guide us on how we think about women's roles within the churches. And so obviously we're going to bring probably some assumptions to the table here, Sarah, but we're going to try to put those aside today. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, this verse, there's a lot of confusion and controversy even surrounding it. So let's talk about some of those assumptions that we might bring to this, because it's worth recognizing that we have them. We have bias and assumptions that we're bringing. This is one of our apply questions, at least part of it, and we will circle back around to these assumptions at the end.
Good.
But for now, Heather, let's address some of these assumptions that we might have. And you and I might have some similar assumptions just on the way we were raised in the churches we grew up in. And it would be such a fascinating question to ask this to a broader audience.
Yeah.
What comes to mind when you hear this verse? But for me, I think it's probably been interpreted a couple of ways. Either women can't teach at all, or women can't teach men. They can teach other women and they can teach children, but maybe they can't teach other men. But then, Heather, there was that one time that we accidentally recorded an entire podcast, an entire, video here on silent.
We did.
We forgot to turn on the microphone, and we did the entire thing on silent. So maybe, Heather, that was the one time we did it right.
We totally got it right that time. Or Heather had an epic mistake of not turning on the video camera the right way.
30 minutes of us, these silent heads.
Silent talking without actually lips moving, no words.
So maybe we did it right that time.
Totally. No, but I like that you're bringing up these assumptions, Sarah, because what I think happens is we don't realize that there are a variety, almost a spectrum of beliefs across how women are viewed within the church and in leadership specifically within the church. The technical terms are used as egalitarian, which means that women can do all things equal. I always think of gal whenever I think about that. It's pro gals. But then you also have complementarianism, which is a spectrum of beliefs of where women's roles can land within the church. And my husband and I have studied this at great lengths. He's taken classes in his master's on it, and it's one of those things where we were diving deep because what we grew up with and how we grew up was very much in line with what you were talking about as these assumptions, Sarah. We grew up believing that there was a specific role for women in the churches, and it was that they weren't supposed to teach men, and we had to be very careful about where women played in the church. And so it was something both of us had a passion about understanding because of how we grew up, and we just wanted to understand, what does the Bible say on its own terms?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do recognize there is some irony here in the fact that we are women teaching and speaking on the subject of women remaining silent in the church.
Yes.
And yet it's important for us to study, as you've said. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to recognize our bias, our assumptions that we bring. We're going to lay them aside for the moment to try to read the Bible on its own terms, to try to uncover what this passage is saying, what the author Paul,
whether it's pro women or not pro women, we need to just read it for what it says, and then we can come to an understanding of what God's word is talking about.
That's exactly right. Okay, and so we're going to spend a lot of time today in context and research. I mean, we'll nick at each one of the CHARA study methods. For those of you who don't know, CHARA is an acronym: context, history, author, research, and apply. And we're going to camp heavily in context and research today, but we will touch a few others as well. So when it comes to context, especially when I'm talking about the text surrounding the verse, especially when you're reading just one verse. Context is essential, absolutely important. But what we're going to do today is a little bit unique because we're going to I want you to think of this as we're starting with like one verse and we start to just build and expand, almost like if you were to, I've heard it likened to this before and I really like it. If you were to throw a pebble into a pond, you'd start to see those consecutive circles getting bigger and bigger.
Right.
And so that's really what we're going to be doing here.
Cool.
And often we'll just start with a paragraph. So that's what I'm going to do. And when I read the paragraph here, you'll notice there's only 2 verses, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 34 and 35. Actually, 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. You like that, Heather?
It's not giving me much more clarity as I was hoping for. I mean, basically, I feel like we just said what we already, what our verse is already saying. So I'm hoping that maybe going out to that next concentric circle is going to help us a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm hoping so too.
Okay.
It will. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read the part that's specifically talking about one topic, about prophecy here. And as I do that, I'm actually going to read, and I'm going to skip the 2 verses that I just read, verse 34 and 35, because I want you to see how seamlessly this flows in this topic. Okay? So just, if it helps, close your eyes and listen. I'm going to pick up here in 1 Corinthians 14, starting in verse 29. And it says, 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should evaluate. But if something has been revealed to another person sitting there, the first prophet should be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that everyone may learn and everyone may be encouraged. And the prophets' spirits are subject to the prophets, since God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. Verse 36, or did the word of God originate from you, or did it come only to you? If anyone thinks he is a prophet or spiritual, he should recognize that what I write to you is the Lord's command. If anyone ignores this, he will be ignored. So then, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but everything is to be done decently and in order.
Man, the theme that is screaming from this is it's all about prophecy, both before and after. It's very much a whole passage about prophecy itself.
Yeah, and I found there's several commentaries and scholars saying, gosh, these verses sure seem like they're just kind of plopped in there and like out of the blue.
Out of left field.
Yeah. To me, it almost seems like these 2 verses, verse 34 and 35, were inserted as an example. Like Paul's giving us an example here, a real life example of how to evaluate prophecy in a peaceful and orderly way that would benefit everyone. But in context, then, women are not being told not to speak at all. This is referring to a specific kind of speech. We're talking about prophecy, as you said.
Right.
But even more specifically, it's talking about evaluating prophecy and in a way that would be, again, peaceful and orderly. And in verse 39, it actually tells us, brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy. So it's not telling women not to prophesy. If in verse 39 it says, brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy. So again, this verse seems to be more about evaluating prophecy.
Well, yeah, and that totally makes sense because you can see in verse 2 or 29 that 2 or 3 prophets should speak and the other should weigh carefully what is said. It's this idea of there has to be a couple of people around them that are going to be helping them kind of weigh is at least the word that I have in my translation.
Yeah, and there's a couple others, judge and evaluate
what the prophecy is saying. Okay, so this idea that it's okay for us to be evaluating or judging.
And we should be.
And we should be.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. So the first takeaway, we're going to have some takeaways today. The first one that we're going to we see here is that context tells us Paul is referring to a specific kind of speech. Women were not to speak up and judge prophecies in church. That's the first takeaway we see here.
All right.
Okay, so let's continue to expand out just a little bit.
We're doing our concentric circles here.
Yep.
Onto our next ring.
Yep. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just look at the section. Sometimes titles are inserted and it kind of helps break the text into sections. I'm going to look at a section which is verses 26 through 40. And it really only includes 3 more verses to what I just read there. But when we do include those 3 verses, we see this word silent is repeated 3 times. That's something that we look at under author, is we look for repetition. It's one of my favorite things to look for because it just stands out to me.
Yeah.
And so this word silent is repeated in the context of speaking in tongues, speaking prophecy, and also here with women.
Okay.
So when it's speaking in tongues, it's don't speak in tongues unless there's an interpreter. And otherwise just keep silent, because the whole idea is to benefit the church here. And same thing with prophesy one at a time, again, so people can understand.
Yeah, if you have too many people all prophesying at the same time, you're not necessarily able to decipher any of the messages at all.
Exactly.
Okay, there's chaos and disorder.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then we get into our passage about women being silent here. So we see that 3 times repeated.
No, and that's really interesting because what we're hearing, or what at least what I'm observing here, is that it's this idea of it's appropriate for both men and women to be silent at different points to be able to create an order around the church.
That's exactly right. And that really is the theme as we kind of look at context. That's one of the questions is what is the theme that you're seeing? What's the main idea? And that's the theme we're seeing here is that these, spiritual gifts should be used in an orderly way, an orderly worship. And that for all church members, we need to practice self-control, whether you're a man or you're a woman. And at times that might mean remaining silent to promote peaceful worship.
Sounds like my house too.
Yeah, right?
Totally.
Right. Yeah. In verse 33, it said, God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. And in verse 40, everything is to be done decently and in order. So that our second takeaway here is there are times when church members, both men and women, should remain silent to promote orderly and peaceful worship.
I love this because, by the way, you can also look, if you're ever looking at those sections, this concentric circle that happens to be within the section of 26 through, 40, you can see the heading of these sections to see what it might be, the spoiler alert. And my NIV says orderly worship or good order in worship. I think the CSB, when I looked at it earlier, said the order of church meetings. NLT said something like a call of orderly worship. Now, these aren't headings that are Scripture. They're the things that are put in there to help us see the idea or theme, but obviously every single one of the Bible translators were noticing that there's a theme about orderly worship that is coming across loud and clear.
That's exactly right. They can be really helpful. Yeah, the different titles. Absolutely. Okay, as we expand out again.
Another concentric circle.
Yes.
Okay.
We're going to be looking at chapter 14 now.
The full chapter.
The full chapter.
Okay.
And again, we're going to see some repetition if we do that. This term build up is repeated at least 5 times, but actually even more if you're reading right up to chapter 14, you see that theme even more, this idea of building up. And in context, it's talking about spiritual gifts should be used to build up the church. In chapter 14, it's mostly talking about prophecy and spiritual or speaking in tongues, but really, as you expand out, all spiritual gifts are for the purpose of building up the church. We see that strengthening and encouraging the church, teaching and bringing understanding, helping others know and worship God, even outsiders know and worship God. I thought 1 Corinthians 14:26 summed it up pretty well. What then shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up.
I love that this verse also just calls out brothers and sisters. This isn't just like a just to the men or just to the women. This is for all. We're seeing them addressing everybody, and we see this kind of throughout these chapters, even leading up to chapter 14, that both women and men are supposed to be using their spiritual gifts, and they're encouraged to both use them. It's both, not just one gender. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that, in fact, is the third takeaway.
Okay.
That spiritual gifts are given to both men and women and should be used for the benefit of others, again, to build and strengthen the church, which is beautiful that God gives us all these spiritual gifts, and they all work beautifully to unite the body of Christ. Yes.
That's so wonderful.
Yes. So now we looked at chapter 14 here. Now, it's kind of interesting that if you notice that as you read the entire chapter, there's really only 2 verses in this whole chapter that talk specifically about women being quiet. And the rest of the time, the author is talking about using these spiritual gifts, again, to build up and edify the church.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that we have in our CHARA guide under author is talking about the amount of space. It's one of the structure questions. And it's what is emphasized by the amount of space that is devoted to a subject. Well, in this case, if you look at how much space is devoted in chapter 14 to these spiritual gifts building up the church, that indicates the author's purpose, which is another one of our CHARA questions here. The author's purpose here is really to, again, using your spiritual gifts to build up the church. The purpose here is not to define the role of women in the church.
And it's a great clarifier, because one of our key principles is we need to not shout where the Bible is whispering and whisper where the Bible shouts. And this is obviously this area of 1 Corinthians. And throughout all of Corinthians, there is no real big moment where it's focusing in on women and their role. It has more to do with the structure of the church and how the church is supposed to be orderly, and how they're supposed to be using their gifts. This is really insightful.
And yet this is a passage that we often turn to talk about the role of women in the church.
Again, this is where we take verses out of context. We are reading it by itself, and we don't think about, and you just, concentric circled us all the way out to just to the chapter. And we learned so much just by reading the chapter. This isn't like us reading the entire book of 1 Corinthians.
Right.
Though I'm sure we probably could read the entire book of 1 Corinthians and get something more out of it.
Yeah. So the fourth takeaway then is that Paul's purpose was to promote orderly worship, not to define the role of women in the church.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So we've covered immediate context, I think probably well enough.
Yeah, you did. I love it.
Hopefully, right? But Paul does tell women to remain silent elsewhere, or actually, I'm sorry. The question is, does Paul tell women to remain silent anywhere else in the book?
Okay, so this is the idea of let's go look at the book now, this context. Okay, good.
Yeah, so that again we're expanding out, but we're going to be looking at the book context now, and then also, does he do it anywhere else in the New Testament, any of the other letters? So we'll get there.
Okay, good.
But for book context, we actually find just the opposite. If you turn to 1 Corinthians 11, 4 through 5, it says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved.
This verse is typically, there's a lot in this verse.
There is.
This is one of those verses for me that I would probably, in the middle of studying a verse like our verse, I would write this in a journal and say, I want to go CHARA this at another time, because there's probably more I could unpack about this idea of heads coverings. But what we are seeing in this verse is this idea that that women are prophesying. That is coming out very loud and clear.
That's exactly why I brought this up. I know this verse can add some confusion of its own, but simply I brought it up to show the point that Paul is assuming that both men and women are praying and prophesying in a decent and orderly way.
Good.
So that's our fifth takeaway. Okay. In the same book, we see women praying and prophesying publicly in a peaceful way.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, before we expand to Bible context, I want to pause here, and we're going to jump over to research. I said that was one of the things that we're going to look at. We get a little bit nerdier sometimes in research. Hang with us, folks. We're going to look at some of the original language in 1 Corinthians 14 and look at some of the word meanings behind this verse. And so the first thing that I learned is that the Greek word for woman and wife are the same. The same Greek word can be translated as woman or wife. The same goes for husband and man.
And this happens a lot with the Greek language, where we're going to find multiple English words to describe the one Greek word, or the one Greek word is using multiple English words. And so oftentimes we can use different Bible translations to get to a spot where we can maybe see where it's triangulating around the idea of a word. But based on what I've studied in this is not one of those moments where we're going to see different Bible translations using different words. But it is helpful for us to understand that the Greek is going to oftentimes represent two different types of words. Okay.
No, you're right. And in fact, this happened to be one of those times I had to go to outside resources. That's one of our things that we talk about under research is, can you use outside resources, from biblical scholars to help you understand what is being talked about here? And I had to do that because I don't know Greek, and in this case, Bible translations weren't really helping me, but some resources were. So let me give a quick shout out to what I am going to be pulling from here. There's two of them. One is the Bible Knowledge Commentary, and the other one is Recovering Biblical Ministry by Women by Winston. Okay, so there's these two resources that were really helpful here, and you might want to pick up if you really want to study this subject. But okay, so there's three reasons that a wife, that I believe that a wife is what is being addressed in this passage, and not all women. Okay. So let's look at that here, because we just talked about that Greek word again could mean either wife or woman,
Right.
and I think the indicators are saying it's wife. Here's three reasons why. The first one, the word submission that we find in this verse, as it relates to women. Any other time you see that word in the New Testament, as it relates to women, it's always in the context of a husband and wife relationship.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, number two, in the same passage, the Greek word for woman and wife is translated as woman, but the Greek word for man or husband is translated as husband. So you'll notice that in verse 34 and 35.
Yeah, go back and reread it again. It
Yes.
actually is interchanging these two.
Right.
The words are woman or and husband.
Yes. So it makes more sense if it's talking about a husband-wife relationship than it would be a husband-woman relationship.
Right.
Okay. And the third thing is it would be really difficult for an unmarried woman or a widow to go ask their husbands at home if they have any questions,
Yes.
as we saw in our verse. So all that is to say, it appears that it's kind of an unfortunate rendering of Greek here in 1 Corinthians 14, where it uses this all-encompassing term woman when it really makes more sense contextually if it's talking about a wife.
Well, yeah. So let's go back and try to paraphrase or replace the word wife with woman, or for woman,
Yeah.
or vice versa. And so this is what it would read like: wives should remain silent in the church. They're not allowed to speak, but in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a wife to speak in the church. That makes more sense.
It does, and especially when you start at the end, we'll pull some of these takeaways and we'll put them together. But the takeaway we get here, takeaway number six, is this passage is likely speaking to a husband and wife relationship.
Yeah. I want to just shout out here, Sarah, that this took some external resources for you to pull from. And I think that's really important that, there's a lot of resources out there. Remember I talked about the egalitarian versus complementarian mix. My husband and I actually went through and started reading all of those books across the spectrum to understand this topic, because we wanted to see all different points of view so that we could see who was taking the Bible on its own terms and how could we really understand it. And you're uncovering this as well. It's very easy for us to be able to find the right resources, because we're not always going to find it just by reading the text itself, but having the right resources. And honestly, reading a lot of different resources helps you start to see who's really reading the Bible for what it is versus kind of putting their own biases and assumptions into the resource that they're writing.
Because resources, right, yeah, they're all different.
And they're written by humans.
And so you still have to use and apply, like the CHARA study guide. Like, you have to use your brain. Which one makes the most sense here contextually?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So that's a great shout out, and something that is worth noting, for sure. Okay, so
you said you were going to take us to Bible context.
I
next.
am.
Is that where we're going?
Yep, that's where we're going. We're going to go to Bible context now. And I'm going to read a passage. I know this gets a little bit nerdy here. Hang in with us, as we take one more step here. There is a sister passage in 1 Timothy that really closely parallels our passage here in 1 Corinthians. These two verses are often brought up together when we're talking about women's roles in the church. And we may have some listeners out there who are wondering, well, are they going to bring up 1 Timothy? So this is for you. We want to make sure we address the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
We're going to do it. But not only that, actually, some of the very same tools we just applied to 1 Corinthians will apply here to 1 Timothy as well. So we're not going to hang here very long, but we want to spend just a couple minutes at least touching this.
Yep.
So the passage I'm talking about in 1 Timothy is found in chapter 2, verses 11 through 12. It says, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." Okay, so a few observations here. If you noticed, I said quietness and quiet. It was repeated there in that verse, not silent. So there's quietness in this case. It cannot mean silence for two reasons. The first one being that, again, 1 Corinthians 11:4 and 5 assumes that women are praying and prophesying. Okay, so that would contradict. The Bible does not contradict itself, and God doesn't give contradictory commands either.
No.
So we've got to figure out how to reconcile those. The second reason quietness can't mean silence is because actually, it's, like I said, it's a different word.
Yes.
And in Greek, this word quietness or quiet means calm, peaceful, tranquil. And it's not the same word. It doesn't mean silent, as we saw back in 1 Corinthians.
Okay.
So that's one.
Okay.
Again, now that's the second reason here, the second thing we see here is this word submission was used again, if you noticed. And we already covered that when we see the word submission in the New Testament as it relates to women, it's always referring to a husband-wife relationship. Okay. And then the third thing I'm going to note here, and again, this kind of points back to what we already saw, is we're going to look at some Greek and some grammar. And in both cases, this suggests that we're talking again about a wife, not all women. The Greek word, again, for woman and wife are the same. So it could have been translated either way.
Yeah.
Okay. But their usage in verses 11 and 12 is singular. And so it could be referring to a private conversation between a man and a woman. And in that culture, this would have really only happened. It was only appropriate for this to happen between family members. So this verse is really best to be understood in a household context, not in a church service.
That's good. That's really helpful. I love that you use the exact same tools that you used in 1 Corinthians to help us with this, because it helps us understand a little bit more about the idea of how women were portrayed within the Bible. It also makes me think about Bible context a little bit more, because we see throughout the Bible, we see women that are used to advance the kingdom of God. You have somebody like Phoebe that is a deacon in the church and was likely the one that delivered and read the letter of Romans to the church in Rome. You have somebody like Priscilla, who and her husband Aquila were co-workers of Paul, and we see Priscilla's name always mentioned first, which is usually in that era was a sign of respect and a sign of importance. And we see her correcting and the understanding of people's understanding of the gospel. You have another one like Junia, who was a standing among the apostles that's listed. But even that's just New Testament. I mean, and I could go on. But even in the Old Testament, we have somebody like the prophet Huldah, who was a contemporary of Habakkuk and of Jeremiah, and she was asked by young King Josiah to explain the scriptures to her. So she went in and actually told him and taught him the scriptures. And this is the type of stuff we see throughout the Bible, is these women that were going before us, these legacy of women that were going before us to show us that they can advance the kingdom and are using their spiritual gifts to build up the church.
I love that you added that, Heather, because I think it's so important to not just bring up other Bible verses that might, push or promote whatever you're bringing to the table, but also bring up the others, like all of the situations you just did, where these women their spiritual gifts were being used for the kingdom of God, like you said. That is so powerful. Yeah. New Testament and Old Testament. They were not remaining silent, and God was using them powerfully.
That's exactly right. And we love that Jesus loved women. We love that we see that throughout and it was very countercultural, which I think sometimes is a little bit of a hard one for us when we're reading the Bible, is how much of this is cultural versus timeless? How are we supposed to be reading it? And we're seeing quite clearly that women were obviously very much honored as part of the ministry of spreading who Jesus was.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, before we wrap this up, there's just one more kind of quick pit stop, I think, that we can take that is a little bit interesting. It's something we haven't addressed yet. And that's, we're going to jump over to history for a moment. And we're going to ask ourselves, how did the original audience, how would they have heard this message? Specifically pertaining to the law. Now, let me reread our verse again. It's been a minute. And listen to where the law is brought up. It says, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says.
What law is it talking about?
Well, that's exactly the question. It's very ambiguous. There is no specific Old Testament law that mandates that women should be silent or submissive. And so some scholars even suggest this could be referring to a local law. And there's two reasons for that. One, at the time, Greeks traditionally held that women should not speak in public to men who are not their husbands. So this was very, like you just talked about, cultural. In Greek culture, that was really frowned upon. Okay. So there's that. And I saw that in multiple commentaries. Also, usually in the New Testament, when an Old Testament law is being referenced, you will see that the word law capitalized. But here in this verse in 1 Corinthians 14, different translations do this differently. Some have it capitalized and some do not, which just is showing us there's some ambiguity.
There you go.
Okay. And so I bring all of this up to show that this is not directly quoting an Old Testament law.
So we can make sure that this isn't something that they're trying to pull over from a past, like rituals or anything of that nature. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, most likely it could be referring to a local law. But so it's not referring to a specific Old Testament law. This law seems to be lost in time. We really don't know. Okay. And it apparently wasn't important enough for Paul to bring it up again. Whatever law he's referring to, if it was that important,
he would have talked about it again.
That's
exactly it. Again, the Bible shouts things that need to be that are really important.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've given us 6 takeaways today. There's
You
a
counted,
lot.
yes.
I did. I was keeping track. So I want to make sure you help us kind of summarize and get through like what we learned here today, because there's a lot we unpacked and really important stuff we unpacked.
That is fair, and let's do that because there was a lot. Takeaway number 1. Context tells us that Paul is referring to a specific kind of speech. Women were not to speak up and judge prophecies in a church. So we're not talking about all speech. Women were not supposed to speak up and judge prophecies in church. Okay. Takeaway number 2. There are times when church members, both men and women, should remain silent to promote orderly and peaceful worship. Okay.
Totally makes sense.
Number 3, spiritual gifts are given to both men and women and should be used for the benefit of others to build up the church. Hopefully this is sounding familiar. Number 4, Paul's purpose was to promote orderly worship, not to define the role of women in the church. Okay. Number 5, in the same book, we see women praying and prophesying publicly in a proper way.
Yep.
So we see the exact opposite happening.
We see, exactly.
Yeah. Number 6, this passage is likely speaking to a husband and wife relationship.
Okay. It's a lot of takeaways.
It is.
They're powerful takeaways, though. I'd love to hear how you would paraphrase, which is one of our research questions of how you would paraphrase a verse like this. Remember, our verse is 1 Corinthians 14:34. It says women should remain silent in the churches. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. How do you paraphrase something like this?
I'm going to keep it simple. I'm not going to overcomplicate it. A wife should not publicly question her husband's own prophecy.
Simple.
Mm-hmm. And I pulled that from really just 2 of those takeaways. Okay. The first one and the last one that we're referring to this being a specific kind of speech, evaluating prophecy. And the last one being that this is really between a husband and wife relationship. You add those 2 together and you get my paraphrase of a wife should not publicly question her husband's own prophecy.
Well, yeah, and I'm looking at the other takeaways here, and it looks as though all the rest of them are focused on men and women that should use their spiritual gifts in an orderly way. And so there's a little bit of a summary there as well, but that's not what our verse is necessarily talking about. Right. That's just the context around our verses that got us there.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's cool about the other takeaways is it actually does give you some clarity into a women's role in church and what should be encouraged and not encouraged, really what should be encouraged. Mm-hmm. So we do see some about a woman's role, just not necessarily in those 2 verses where we started.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. So are we ready to apply?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Let's do it. So we started at the very beginning. We talked about some of these bias and assumptions that we bring to this. And I said we were going to bring it back up. And here's the reason why. The second part of that question is, what do you need to surrender, if anything, to be in harmony with the Bible? That is a very honest kind of soul-searching question.
Yes, it is.
And depending on what assumptions you brought to this text, this might be different for all of us. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the very first one. What do we need to surrender, Lord? Mm-hmm. And I do want to highlight here, one of the key principles that we have under apply is that the Bible cannot mean now what it didn't mean back then. So here's the deal. If it didn't mean that women should remain silent in church settings and not use their God-given spiritual gifts back then it doesn't mean that today. Mm-hmm. So in this, the meaning remains the same. Mm-hmm. However, how we apply this to our lives may look different for each of us. And because of that, we need to pray. Just like we would with any other Bible passage, we should be praying, Lord, what do you want me to learn and how should I apply this to my life? And we should be taken into consideration and respond to the timeless truth that we do learn from this verse. And I think the timeless truth that I took away, and I'm curious, maybe you have something else, Heather, but is use your spiritual gifts in a peaceful and orderly way for the benefit of others. That applies to men and women.
No, I love that. I mean, so I mentioned earlier on that my husband and I, we've studied this quite a bit, and we both grew up in families and in church environments where they had a very specific view about women's role in the church. And so as we studied this, I'm not going to lie, our world was flipped upside down, because what we thought was a more submissive, quiet, not teaching role for women in the church was drastically changed. And it actually took us a while to be able to get to terms with that, because this was this shook us a little bit. We weren't ready for having our worldview changed when we read the Bible on its own terms, because it wasn't what we grew up believing.
That's not easy.
No, it wasn't.
Not,
and I'm not going to say that it was like, oh yeah, one day we were like believing one thing and the next day we weren't. It was a slow process of us uncovering and reading the verses and double checking what we were reading to make sure that we understood what we saw. And what you uncovered today, Sarah, is where we landed, was that we are all given spiritual gifts, men and women both, and we should be using them in an orderly fashion in order to glorify God and further his kingdom. We shouldn't use them to distract each other or distract from the church being furthered, but that it has nothing to do with whether you're woman or man. Like there's an opportunity. Now, obviously there's a large spectrum, and my husband and I both ended up landing on the spectrum of that belief. And you will probably, as you study your own scripture and see what we've uncovered today, and maybe go and dive into this yourselves, go and look up these verses and see for yourself. You're going to end up on that same spectrum as you start to have the Bible come to life for you.
Because really that is our hope here, is really to train you how to study the Bible on your own. Yeah, absolutely. And now is when we kind of hope that we really did turn the sound on in this podcast, and that,
or we may be retaking
or we were silent.
It's silent. Oh no! So Sarah, I just want to thank you for tackling such a controversial, I don't know if I'd call it that, but very confusing passage that often can ask a lot of questions and maybe comes with a lot of weight behind it.
Yeah.
So thank you for taking time. You know, if you are interested in learning how to study the Bible, number one, go get the study guide that goes along with this and dive in and study this passage. You won't regret it. But there's also a ton of other resources on our website that you can get that will give you tips and tricks on how to study the Bible. I also would recommend that you subscribe to the CHARA Project, because we are doing this all the time, where we are unpacking different passages and teaching you how to study the Bible and read the Bible on its own terms. We look forward to hearing from you next time, or seeing you next time as we continue to study the Bible. See you next time.